Productive Pastor 18, Why HR Matters in the Church. What's going on, friends? We're back, Productive Pastor, episode 18, and I've got a special person that we're going to be talking with today. You might be thinking, Chad, why are you talking about HR? Some of you might know me too well and say, Chad, you really need to talk about HR. But I'm going to introduce our guest in a moment. We're going to have a fun back and forth conversation with somebody who knows much more about this than I do, but also understands the church and all the uniqueness it has. So just one little quick piece of housekeeping before we jump into the conversation. Are you part of the Productive Pastor community on Facebook yet? Or as we like to call it, the Productive Party. It's a lot of fun. We're having a great group of folks over there. Tons of fun discussions. Just encourage you just to cruise over through the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/pp/018. Come hang out in the show notes. Come hang out over in the Productive Pastor community because we'd love to have you there. So, we're not going to just make this last any longer than it needs to. I have got a special guest with me today. This is actually not their first time on Productive Pastor. This is their first time on the new Productive Pastor, and it's my wife, Meredith Brooks.
Hello.
Mary, you were on ages ago, and I think we talked about like lessons that you learned from completing an Ironman. Was that it?
Yes. It was something around the discipline and like taking small actions to accomplish a big goal, something like that.
Yeah, it was along those lines. So if you don't know this or not, Meredith and I, we are very, very different. Some of y'all have met Meredith, or Mare, or Maramaw, all of the different names that she has. But, Meredith and I, if you look at our strengths profiles, they look the same if you hold them upside down, where pretty much my top 10 or her bottom 10, and her top 10 or my bottom 10. So we laugh about that. But, over the years, one of the things we've learned is just the ways that we both get the same things done, but in very similar and very different ways. And so we're going to talk about HR. You might be saying, Chad, this isn't really a leadership podcast. Why are you talking about HR on Productive Pastor? Well, I want to have Mary on to talk about it because there's nobody better than her that I know at it. And she's worked at churches, she worked in ministry before. But also, this is the thing, so many of the conversations that we have, like the back channel conversations, whether they're in the Productive Pastor community or in coaching conversations I have when I'm working one-on-one with people, so many of the hills that we are trying to climb in ministry productivity, a lot of them come back to human resources and HR. So that's why I wanted to have Meredith on. So we're going to jump in. And first, Ms. Glitter, how did you get into HR? And share as much as you want to or can share about you and HR right now.
Okay. Nothing too confidential. So I guess just as a summary, I've been in HR for about 10 years. I've worked for very large corporations. So I worked for one company that had about 42,000 employees, and the company I work for now has about 5,000 employees. So I've learned a lot about, best practices around HR. And I primarily work in the compensation field, so determining, who gets paid what. But just being kind of in the HR space for the past 10 years, I've seen kind of all aspects of the HR profession. And then, so that's been my professional life. But then obviously in my personal life, being married to you and seeing, how you operate as a leader within a church, how churches tend to operate, how nonprofits like the Wesley Foundation.
Because you stepped out of corporate HR world for around a year, and you served as a development officer for a Wesley Foundation. It's for campus ministry at a Methodist church.
Yes, I did. I think it was maybe like a midlife crisis, but I thought, I'm going to kind of go out on my own, be a consultant, provide development and communications and human resources, consulting basically for nonprofits. And I realized quickly into that I really like the corporate 8 to 5 structure. I am not one to go out on my own. That's kind of one area where we hugely differ probably on our strengths is that I really like the corporate environment. And, like The Office is one of my favorite shows, and my daily life is a lot like Office episodes.
Well, that kind of comes back because I think that we need to talk about, as I was thinking about this, I don't think a lot of people really understand what HR is. And if you do have an idea of HR, it's Toby from The Office.
Right.
And that's what you think. All that you think HR is that person that's keeping Michael from doing Michael things. But HR is so much more than that.
Yeah, it really is. I think for so long, HR was viewed, and I mean, you just look at the history of HR, and it was viewed really as primarily like an administrative function, and then more of like a personnel function. But it's really evolved to be now just basically, a people operations department for a company, for an organization. And so when you look at that, there's many different facets to it. In my role now, when we make decisions, we try to look at it from the employee life cycle and where is this on that spectrum, and is it a positive impact for the employee? And so that's taken into account, onboarding employees, bringing them into your organization, training them, developing them, growing them, making sure they're compensated fairly, making sure they're managed and their performance is managed, in a clear and consistent way. And then all the way through to exit, making sure that you're exiting people properly. And so, I don't know, there's just so much to human resources that I think one can be overwhelming to like a smaller organization like a church, or a church with 2, 3, 4 employees may say, well, that's something we don't either have time or don't need to do because we're so small and we just kind of all work together. And that's really kind of what we've talked about a lot, is that I think if you have one employee, there are certain HR practices that you absolutely need to implement to really protect yourself as a leader, as a pastor, and just as an employer.
Yeah, because the thing is that, and I was thinking about this the other day talking with somebody, even if you have a staff of 2, you and a secretary, there are 3 people in the staff relationship, because the congregation really fulfills the role of another person that you are responsible for. And so even if you are in a scenario where you've got a part-time secretary, you're the pastor, everybody else is volunteer, but you've got the church, that congregation's needs are the things that you are having to design and manage this stuff around, and that they are this kind of function inside of it. So you talked about that there's a handful of things that they're just best practices, and that's really what we want to jump onto today, was just a handful of best practices. I'm sitting here shooting off the hip. Meredith is nervous, like, what are we going to talk about today? She has a list in front of her. Whole 9 yards, y'all. She does so much better at this than I do. But that was the idea. Is like, hey, we're going to talk about some best practices for the church, because you've worked in when we were first married, you were working at a church.
Yes.
The secretary. You worked when I was in seminary. You worked inside of the seminary for a while. Mm-hmm. So you've been around ministry. You actually worked for me for like 6 months a year. That was a train wreck.
Yeah, that did not go well.
It's like, we will never do this again. But you feel like you understand so much of, especially this current iteration of Productive Pastor, the normal size church. You have been around that for the last 20 years. So yes. What are these best practices that you have from the corporate world that you think are just things to think about inside of ministry?
Yeah, so I have 3 kind of key things that I think any leader should implement into your, ministry, whether it's church, whether that's a nonprofit organization, whatever the case may be. If you're in a leadership role and have the ability to implement these things, I would highly encourage you to do so. So I've got 3 kind of best practices that we can run through, and then also some resources that I recommend. So the first, and this is something that I tell Chad all the time, is you want to manage to a policy, not to a person. If you have clear defined policies around certain key areas, HR practices, ministry areas, however you want to bucket that out, then when you have to call someone into account, or you have to discipline someone, you can say, it's no one feels kind of personally attacked. It's because that's the policy, and it should be clear, it should be understood, it should be agreed upon by the SBR and whatever the case may be. Like for instance, churches are really unique when it comes to like a time and attendance type scenario, because as we all know, churches are not Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. You've got a lot of nights, you've got weekends, you've got, maybe a trip that lasts several days. So if you want to say, okay, employee A, I want the expectation is that you're going to work 40 hours a week, and it's not going to look like Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. So let's look at what that's going to look like for you, and let's create a way for you to be accountable to that. And so the policy then becomes, this is the expectation for this role, is that these are, and of course there can be some exceptions, but you get what I'm saying, is like,
well, and it protects the staff member also as well, because if there's policies in effect, it's not just the SPR, that's a Methodist language for the HR committee, essentially. It's supposed to be there at every church, or the board, whatever your tradition is, or the pastor telling somebody, oh, you're not working enough, you're not turning your hours in. But also the other side of that is, think back to my time in youth ministry and what that looked like. And when I was young and like newer in ministry, and I was clearly working, 40, 50, 60 hours a week.
Yeah, way more than 40.
Yeah, and there was no way to there was no sort of set in stone. Mm-hmm. So like if you're in student ministry coming off a 10-day mission trip and you're expected to be back in the office 8 hours a day, you come back on Sunday, come in Monday, those expectations in that scenario, this goes both ways. It's not just it's not just about getting somebody in trouble.
Right, yeah, it's to prevent someone from, it's just basically setting a clear expectation for both parties to come to an understanding of, this is the expectation. So someone coming in would say, I don't have to work 70 hours a week. I only have to work the 40 to 45 or whatever is set out. But also I know I can't work 30 because I'm expected to work 40. So it protects people from working, either way more or less than that what's needed for that position. We could get all into the, exempt and non-exempt and all that kind of stuff, but that's a whole bag of worms around pay. But I just think whatever the policy may be in whatever area of their employment it may be, if you have a clear policy around, corrective action, how things are going to be handled, performance reviews, all those type of things, if people come into the role and they have a clear understanding of how they're going to be managed, how their work is going to be managed, then I think it just sets you both up for success, because you don't have to question, what is this person expecting of me? You know what they're expecting. And
because that's the thing is, you've been on church staffs before, all that. It's a weird, different relationship so many times with church staffs. And what you said, you managed the policy, not the person.
Right. Because a lot of times, too, in a church, you're their boss, you're their pastor, you're their friend. And so when there are really kind of well-functioning SPR, staff parish relation, or HR committee, I think that's good, because that's taking that responsibility off of the pastor. But, we know that's not always the case. Yeah. And sometimes we'll kind of get down into this, one of my recommendations, but it's like at the end of the day, as the lead pastor, you are responsible for that employee and for how they're performing. And so I think it's important that even if there is a staff parish relation committee, that everyone's on the same page with what the expectations are. So that's number one, is manage to a policy, not to a person. So number two, kind of along the similar lines, is to set clear performance expectations. And so to that end, I think it's really beneficial to check in regularly on two elements primarily. One would be results. And so it's looking at what they're getting done in their job, in their role. But then the other element you want to look at is behavior and how they're getting it done. Because they could be knocking it out of the park, but they can have a horrible attitude, and that's not fun for anyone. They could have a great attitude, but not getting anything done. Well, that's not good either. So you want to make sure you're developing people in a way that both of those things are coming up simultaneously. I was listening to a podcast not long ago from the former CEO of Yahoo before they were bought. And when she came into the role, she basically looked at the people, they were going through a merger, and she said, okay, who do we want to keep? And she said, if someone is performing well but has a bad attitude, we'll coach them, see if they can change that attitude, but they could be the greatest performer, but I don't want them, and I think that's pretty telling is that can really, a bad attitude can really permeate an organization, and that's in the corporate world, that's in the church world, the nonprofit, whatever it may be. And so I think when you're looking at reviewing performance, you want to look at those two elements. And annual performance reviews have gone the way of dodo, if that's still a saying. But that's very antiquated, and it's just not fast enough for the pace of the world that we live in.
Yeah.
A lot of companies are moving more to pulse check-ins. What I recommend would be a quarterly review. So that way each quarter, and churches are very cyclical. You've got seasons of ministry. And so each of those quarters, and I know you talk about that in the season of Productive Pastor, is, the quarter. Those seasons of ministry are going to look very different. And so going through Advent and summer could look very different than spring and fall.
And it's also interdependent on what the staff person's role is.
Right.
Because say you have someone in music ministry coming in and you're heading into Advent, which is a massive, insane season for anybody who's, let's call it platform leadership. So preachers, musicians, worshipers, that sort of thing. If they're coming into Advent and they don't know that there's a high level of expectation of just there, but it's also the point in time for them to broker that relationship. If you're talking about what kind of, because when you talk about performance review in ministry, that's kind of an icky concept. But what you're really doing is this is managing expectations of, in this moment, what is the most important thing for you to do. So say you're in some high steeple downtown church that is going to have 15 different public events during the Advent season. It's completely okay for the preaching staff and for the ministry staff to come in and say, "Hey, listen, we're going to don't ask me to also inventory the handbells during December." And so that performance piece, that then again, it goes both ways because it's allowing that person to say, "I'm going to do what I need to do, but please don't expect something." Or if you have a huge downtime,
right.
And what did you do with this? Well, and that's kind of goes back to that quarter philosophy I had, is if you have a particular ministry that's just slow during that moment, then a different level of expectations can be negotiated and can be measured based off what that season's like.
Yes. And I think that's key is that, each of these performance reviews and kind of performance plans, it's not one size fits all for your whole staff. It's going to be differ based on the position. I mean, just like it does, my role and my performance expectations at work differ from one of my coworkers because we do different jobs and we have different responsibilities. So I think it's important too to not say, okay, I'm going to, I'm going to have 4 main goals that every employee needs to do. It needs to be individualized to that person and their role. So that's number 2 is set clear performance expectations. Okay. So number 3, and that's really pretty simple, but it sounds simple, but it's the hard part of actually taking action and implementing these things, making this a priority. I can see how an organization might look at this and say, we just do not have time for this. But it's one of those things where it's if you invest in setting up some, kind of key HR practices, I think it will pay off in dividends in employee engagement, employee satisfaction, employee performance.
And you won't waste time, or you won't lose massive momentum.
Right.
When you have a giant drain on everything.
Yeah, and you don't have to recreate the wheel, when you run into, say an employee is exiting and someone's hiring, and how did we bring that person on? What all did we have to do? If you just create some, I know you talk about this a lot, and Productive Pastor is setting up systems, creating some Trello boards around this kind of stuff. I think it would be fairly easy to do, and I'm happy. I mean, I'm not a consultant or anything, but I'm happy to help with.
We can book her. We can. If you want to book Meredith, you can absolutely just get in contact with me. You can book her. Yes. She's great at it.
I do love having conversations about this kind of stuff, and I think it can be really helpful. So to that end, I have some resources that I thought I could share. One is it's a book called The Four Disciplines of Execution, and it's by the Franklin Covey group, Stephen Covey. And it's helpful because, the organization that I work for right now, we are a company that has grown massively through COVID and through acquisition. And so there's so many processes and systems that we need to implement, that right now so many different companies are doing individually, and we're trying to create one kind of global system. But the challenge is you've got your, BAU, business as usual, daily work that just doesn't stop. And it's not like you get to press the pause button on all of those things to then implement new things. You got to figure out how to do them both at the same time. So this book really speaks to that. How do you do it? How do you essentially project manage through setting up systems? And it talks about, the whirlwind being just kind of everything that's going on in the day-to-day business. That's not going to stop. So how do you manage that in a way that you can create new systems, processes? So I really recommend that, Four Disciplines of Execution. The second one I recommend is Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. I love Jocko Willink, and it's kind of extreme, as it says in the title.
So he's an ex-Navy SEAL officer.
Right.
And he looks like it.
Yeah. And he's pretty, intense and extreme. And his podcast, the Jocko podcast, I really enjoy it because it's a lot of like military leadership conversations. And it's just interesting to hear from.
But when you talk military leadership, because we'll listen to Jocko's podcast on road trips. Mm-hmm. When you say military leadership, it's
like colonels,
like admirals, or this like the person that was in charge of going and grabbing bin Laden.
Right.
That they all started off as just like in the SEALs or in the teams during Vietnam. So decades of experience. And you hear about failure a lot in there too.
Right. Yes. And his podcast is a really good resource. And his book is, he has a consulting group and they work with companies, and they really just drive home the point of ownership. At the end of the day, you are responsible for ABC. You're responsible for everything that happens within the umbrella of your organization if you are in that top leadership position. And so I think that's important for pastors to realize. Sometimes it's like you don't want to think of it that way, but I know what I've witnessed, Chad, like through starting Foundry and just going through different kind of seasons of ministry, is it's kind of like, if you don't do it, who's going to?
Well, and ownership's a big piece, because also I know that not everybody who's in productive pastoral land is United Methodist. A lot of them are, and a lot more Presbyterians, this sort of thing, and some sort of a denominational system. We've probably also all worked with pastors that did not see responsibility as a thing. It's just, especially in Methodist world, where guaranteed appointments.
Right.
Responsibility that's an odd concept,
mm-hmm.
and it's kind of a tenuous conversation sometimes. But it's ownership.
And that absolutely includes having strong relationships with the different committees, the different boards that you work with, to where it's not just you saying, this is what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it. But it's really just kind of at the end of the day saying, I am taking ownership for this and I'm going to lead this organization.
Yeah.
So that's book number 2. Book number 3, I'm actually reading it right now. But I'm a couple pages in, but it's really good. But it's David Novak. He was the CEO and co-founder of Yum Brands, which is the umbrella organization that owns Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and it's called Education of an Accidental CEO. And this is from someone who really kind of started out in the ranks and rose up and became CEO. And kind of as he goes through just the first pages, and I've listened to a lot of things from him, read some of his other books. And so, I think it's just an interesting perspective of someone who didn't necessarily seek out a leadership position, but found themselves in that place. And so I think a lot of pastors, you're not necessarily going into vocational ministry to be a leader, but you are a leader. Yeah. And so I think that could be a helpful resource.
I will say that we went to Houston this weekend and drove there and back. And what podcast that we listened to? A bunch of
so that's the other 2 podcasts. One is How Leaders Lead, and that's with David Novak, the CEO of Yum Brands, former CEO. He's retired. but wisdom from the top.
That was interesting because what so much of it talks about is the process and that idea of accidental leadership. Because and it sounded almost like a path to ministry, because people at some point in time, somebody came to that person and said, "Hey, you've got some skills. Mm-hmm. We need to start talking about managing your career and what the next job's going to look like for you." And that, and I'm not saying that means that pastors, you move around, but it's the development angle,
right? And
hearing how those people were developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Wisdom from the Top podcast, it's very interesting. It has, everyone from the CEO, like we listened to one about the CEO of Taco Bell, CEO of Popeyes, CEO of Target. There's just all, the former chairman of JP Morgan Chase, just people leading these giant organizations. And the conversations are always so fascinating to me because at the end of the day, they're everyday normal people who started out on a career path.
And none of them sound like what you think a CEO would sound like.
Right. Yeah, all very relatable. And, I've listened to a lot of those, and because I have a lot of kind of leadership aspirations in my career, and I would say about 50% want that path to leadership at the top. And the other 50% is it was identified in them by someone else and they helped them on that path. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear how people get into these leadership positions and how they handle them, how they handle failure, which is inevitable, how they handle success, how they handle challenges.
We've not heard one yet that doesn't have a big failure moment.
Right. Yeah, the Popeyes lady.
Oh, the Popeyes lady.
she had a big failure at KFC and then went to Popeyes.
But she still stayed in fried chicken.
Yeah, and David Novak, who the CEO of Yum Brands, one of his biggest failures of his career was Crystal Pepsi.
Okay. I liked Crystal Pepsi, but okay. Yeah.
Yes. So, but he also invented Cool Ranch Doritos. So it's just fascinating listening to these and hearing about, so I know that's kind of venturing off a little bit from the HR
that's a little more
world.
Businessy than, but right. That show is just, it humanizes leadership decisions.
Yes, and I think kind of going back to that initial conversation we had about how HR is transformed, and sometimes people view HR just as Toby from The Office, but it really encompasses employee development, leadership development, succession planning, all of those things that they don't just happen. Yeah. Or, they may happen, but you'd be pretty lucky. It takes intention.
It's deeply strategic.
Yes.
And that's the thing, is that's kind of where we kind of pick back in the productive pastor world is, just keeping your fingers crossed for the Holy Spirit to move is not a strategy. Listening to the Spirit, understanding, and then developing to get to that place is essential. And all these resources, they really do talk about the developmental pathway that happens. Fourth one, I'm excited about the fourth one. Because it's an I told you so moment.
Oh, Boundaries for Leaders.
You said it did not sound good. I was like, you need to read it. Trust me.
Yes. By Henry Cloud, Boundaries for Leaders. That is a very good book. Chad told me to read it. And this is as I'm looking at kind of developing a team of my own and thinking, so I'm like, Boundaries for Leaders, and one of my coworkers joked and he said, "Is that court ordered?" So, but it's not, it's really more about like the psychology of leadership and how you're making your employees feel, how you can encourage them to be kind of the best employee they can be. I don't know. It's a really good book. I think it's mistitled because
I would agree, because it does sound like court ordered. Right. Like, okay, what? Yeah, it does. It does.
So that's really all I had. But one of my favorite phrases is fail to plan, plan to fail. And I think in the HR realm, we can kind of even take HR out of the equation, just say employee. You've got to be really intentional about how those relationships are managed, how those roles are managed, because they're kind of the heartbeat of your organization, and that's who's doing the work or the ministry or whatever the case may be. And so, it shouldn't be something that's just a slog. It should be something that's kind of beneficial for everyone.
Because if that goes south, every single thing else goes south.
Yeah, and it can take so much time.
And I'm not good at this. This is me learning from my wife and other people. But like it's a thing, y'all. That's why I wanted to have Meredith on, just to talk about this absolute function. So, Meredith, thanks for being part of Productive Pastor.
You're welcome.
I'll give you a sticker when we're done with this.
Okay.
So, as a thank you gift.
I've already got a few.
Well, I hope y'all like this. Do me a favor. So, Meredith actually is part of the Productive Pastor community. She's on there. She never does anything.
Yeah.
So, if you want to say something to her, you can tag her in that group that's there. But I wanted for us to take the moment today to learn from somebody, A, who's very dear to me, but B, who really knows a lot about this, the inner workings of this, and how it affects and just shapes and shifts the normal size everyday church. And this is a skill that most of us do not learn in seminary. And rather than shooting from the hip, let's learn from people who do this every single day and make this happen. So come in, hang out, engage in the Productive Pastor community. We love to see you there as we have conversations about this throughout the next week. But thanks so much for listening. It's always a privilege to host this, to have this conversation. It's fun. And so until our next episode, I will see you later.